It is now time for a question period. The member from Nipissing.
Thank you, and good morning, Speaker. As an homage to Mr. Cunningham's feistiness, I'll direct my question to the Premier. With last week's budget, Premier, you could have done the right thing and changed the path you put us on. We've all stood here sharing stories of the pain you're inflicting on families throughout Ontario. And we also heard from the rating agencies, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and especially the Auditor General, all warning that you're headed in the wrong direction. So what do? More of the same, more spending, more debt. You continue to use the province's credit card instead of a debit card. Premier, why do you continue to make it harder for Ontarians to pay their bills?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we have a fundamental disagreement with the party opposite. Yeah. The party opposite who ran on a plan to begin by cutting and slashing across government, Mr. Speaker. We said from the beginning that was not our intention. We said that we were going to build this province up, Mr. Speaker. We said we were going to make investments, and that is exactly what we are doing. We are investing in infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. We are investing in transit and roads and bridges. We are investing in people's future in terms of their skill development, Mr. Speaker, youth employment, Mr. Speaker. We know that if we don't make those investments now, we will not have that economic future of which we're capable, Mr. Speaker. So I understand that the party opposite doesn't support that philosophy, doesn't support the fact that we need to build the province up, and at the same time eliminate the deficit, Mr. Speaker. We're on track to do that. We've beaten our targets every year, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to do this in a balanced and moderate way, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Your budget isn't just more of the same. In many instances, it's actually a re-announcement from last year. Take that investment in infrastructure you just spoke of. It was actually word for word in last year's budget, except last year you only needed $3 billion from asset sales to make it work. Now it needs the sale of the GM shares, $9 billion from the sale of Hydro One, the LCBO headquarters, the OPG building. It needs all those now to suddenly make it work. You're selling the public assets to pay for what was already budgeted. It's a shell game. You're really using the money from the sale of Hydro One to reduce your deficit. And without the hydro revenue, you are going to be increasing hydro rates to pay off the mortgage. Premier, why do you continue to increase our hydro bills to pay for your mistakes?
Thank you, Premier.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me just take on a couple of the aspects of what the member opposite have said, both of which are not accurate, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that we are committed to, and we're committed to. We ran in the election, and we put in our budget last year, Mr. Speaker, that we were going to review the assets of this province that were owned by the people of Ontario to make sure that we could leverage them to invest in the assets that are needed today, Mr. Speaker. So those dollars that we will realize, Mr. Speaker, through the opening of the ownership of Hydro One will go into transportation infrastructure that is much needed in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the member opposite that he is a member of a party that sold the 407 in a fire sale that assured no investment for the people of Ontario, Mr. Speaker, that put no controls in place in terms of the ongoing regulation of that asset, Mr. Speaker, all of which are a model of how not to do it, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Premier, the reviews on your budget are in, and they're not pretty. Moody's offered 2 words: considerable risk. Others are claiming a, quote, deteriorating fiscal position. Another said it was, quote, lacking in detail. The worst thing was your chart on page 199. It's the same fake chart that was disclosed in the legislature last year. The fake chart where your own ministry says the fake numbers were, quote, never a real expectation, and it was a deliberate policy. They were, quote, notional targets, and there was no plans to deliver on them. You used the chart again. You guys couldn't even make up a new fake chart. Premier, why do you continue to use these fake numbers that make it so difficult for families in Ontario?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting because what gets said here in the legislature isn't necessarily what gets said back at home. So the real numbers that we are using are numbers that member opposite used apparently in his...
Premier, right after I admonish, you carry on. Second time. The member from Etobicoke North will come to order. Carry on.
This is a general pattern, Mr. Speaker. Apparently on April 20th of this year, so very, very recently, Mr. Speaker, the member for Nipissing talking about health grants awarded. 3 local health organizations will receive a total of $46,400 in one-time funding for the 2014 funding year. These funds, recently announced by Nipissing MPP Vic Fedeli, will go toward mental health and replacement reserve costs associated with supportive housing services in Nipissing. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite knows full well that if we are going to have a healthy society, we have to make investments to support people and support communities. He's happy about that in North Bay, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
I think he should understand that that starts here.
Thank you. Stop the clock, please. You seated, please. You seated, please. Thank you. New question. The member from Nipissing.
To the Premier, please don't add those people to the 94 healthcare workers, including nurses, you've already fired in North Bay. Last week, when asked about the budget, the Premier said, quote, "We don't believe right now that taking more money out of people's pockets would be responsible." But she is. Speaker, I was in the lockup. I spent 7 hours reading the budget. Speaker, I don't know if the Premier read her own budget, if she thinks it isn't filled with schemes to take more money out of people's pockets. The budget included a payroll tax, a cap-and-trade tax on everything, a beer tax, another installment on the aviation fuel tax, increased user fees, and increased hydro rates. Premier, which of those isn't taking more money out of people's pockets?
Premier.
Speaker, the member opposite needs to decide what his line of argument is, Mr. Speaker. He needs to decide, A, whether he believes that it's important that we make investments like infrastructure.
And when I said it'll stay that way. Carry on.
Like infrastructure, like transit, like roads and bridges, like health care, Mr. Speaker, or whether he believes that we should just go straight on and we should slash across government and eliminate the deficit sooner than 2017-18, which is what we're on track to do, Mr. Speaker. Or the third option is he could look at the complexity of the problems that we are confronting as a society. He could understand that we are in a transition in this province in terms of our economy and that we need to create a business climate that helps businesses to locate here and helps them to expand. He would then understand that we need to make those investments in infrastructure that will allow communities to thrive. That is the third path, Mr. Speaker. We're happy to have his support.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Premier, our caucus had 5 budget asks designed to make life better for the people of Ontario. Stop your payroll tax, as it will put a burden on business and cost us jobs. Don't adopt your cap-and-trade tax, as it hurts families by putting a tax on everything. Fix home care by reducing the number of agencies patients must deal with. Make hydro more affordable, as it's chasing away business and causing families to choose between food and fuel, whether to heat or eat. And we asked you to present a serious, credible, detailed plan to balance the budget. You chose to ignore this advice and continue with your tax and spend
Member for
scheme.
Beaches East York,
Premier, will you admit your budget will make it harder for Ontarians to pay?
Question. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just be clear with the member opposite that, and just to look at what he is saying in terms of those asks. He's saying don't deal with climate change, don't do our part, Mr. Speaker. He's saying spend more on health care, Mr. Speaker, and he's saying don't make the investments in transit and transportation infrastructure that we need to make, Mr. Speaker. And he's not acknowledging, Mr. Speaker, that we are in fact on track to eliminate the deficit. And I'll just read from what Don Drummond said, Mr. Speaker, what he said, and I know that Don Drummond is someone the party opposite has quoted many, many times, and here's what he said, and I quote, "The 2015 budget's plan to restore fiscal balance by 2017-18 is credible. The 2012 Commission saw tremendous potential for extracting savings while maintaining and even improving the quality of services by changing the way they were being delivered. The budget offers many examples of Commission recommendations the government is following." I would think he could sign up for that, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. Like most MPPs, I too was home this past weekend. I ran into a guy that I know who has owned a manufacturing shop in North Bay for years. He told me that if things don't pick up, he's going to close and leave the province for other work.
A lot of that going around there.
At a community dinner, a municipal councillor said to me, "Vic, it's like the air is coming out of our economy." At a function yesterday, a woman who moved to BC said she's been following what's happening in Ontario and can't believe
Second time, Minister of Finance.
Province. Premier, this is what people are feeling all across Ontario. Taxes are going up all around them. Hydro rates continue to skyrocket. Premier, when people are suffering all around you, why do you continue to take more out of their pockets?
Thank you. Premier.
Speaker, well, you know, the member opposite ran on a plan to fire 100,000 people as their first action, Mr. Speaker, but I would say to the member opposite, I take from what he said that he would be very supportive of the fact that we have made permanent the Northern Industrial Energy Rate Plan, Mr. Speaker. I would take that he takes as positive, Mr. Speaker, and supports the notion of expanding and adding to our Jobs and Prosperity Fund, Mr. Speaker, and making the forestry industry eligible for those funds, Mr. Speaker, that he would understand that we're doing that because we recognize that forestry is coming back, but that we need to partner with forestry businesses, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that they have a future in Northern Ontario. I think that if he is concerned about the manufacturing and the jobs in the North, Mr. Speaker, he would be very supportive of those initiatives, all of which are included in our budget, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.